Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, poets Khadijah Ibrahiim and Karen McCarthy Woolf discuss the state of poetry in the UK, highlighting key themes preoccupying poets today and how poetry is changing. We also hear the shortlist for the Forward Prizes for Poetry 2023 awards, including a new category, Best Single Poem Performed. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, celebrate the diversity of poetry today and hear tips on what makes a good poem.
Too kind. Thank you. Okay, hi everybody, hi, welcome. We're going to talk about very contemporary poetry. That's what we're going to do for the next hour. And I'm the chair, so I'm just going to do a little bit of introductory stuff and then over to the experts on either side of me. So my name's Jeremy Noel Todd. I teach at the University of East Anglia, where I teach on the Poetry MA. And basically I'm a poetry critic. I've written a lot of poetry reviews in my time. I currently write a poetry Substack, trying to get into the new media world. But yeah, that's my thing. And that's probably all I really need to say before moving on to Karen McCarthy Woolf, who is a poet. But Karen is also here because she was one of the judges for the Forward Prizes this year. And we are going to tell you the shortlist, because they were only announced yesterday, so you may not have had a chance to study them thoroughly. But the Forward Prizes for Poetry, one of the biggest prizes for poetry in the UK, this year has a prize for the best collection and the best first collection, and Karen was involved in judging both those shortlists. Mm-hmm. I've got that right, haven't I?
Yeah.
Okay. But not on your own. You're here representing a panel of judges.
I am. I'm sort of one node of a five-pointed star type of thing, yes.
Okay. And I will just say, I'll just do a brief version of what you can read in the programme or on the festival website, that Karen is the author of 2 poetry collections and the editor of 6 literary anthologies. I didn't realise you'd got half a dozen under your belt.
There's a few more in the older, yeah. It's going to be like, I don't even know how many now. Yeah, there are quite a few, yeah.
But your debut collection, An Aviary of Small Birds, was shortlisted for the Forward First Collection Prize. Mm-hmm. And your latest collection is called Seasonal Disturbances, and it explores gentrification, the city and the sacred, and was a winner of the inaugural Laurel Prize for Ecological Poetry. And then on my left, we have Khadijah Ibrahiim, who is a literary activist, theatre maker and writer from Leeds. She founded and is the artistic director of Leeds Young Authors. She was the executive producer of a documentary called We Are Poets. She's appeared on BBC Radio, and she was hailed as one of Yorkshire's most prolific poets by the BBC. So I hadn't really sort of considered that category. Which Yorkshire poet is the most prolific? I mean, Simon Armitage is quite busy.
Well, he's very busy, and I don't want to take away his title, but that's what the BBC gave to me, and I'll take it. But he's also very prolific as well.
Okay, and Khadijah has published collections with publishers such as People Tree Press. Okay, I think that's the formalities. Oh no, but I haven't said that you are the judge for the other 2 categories, the Forward Prizes, and they are the best single poem, but this year it's been split into 2 shortlists. So there used to just be the prize for the best single poem, but now it's best single poem written and best single poem performed.
That's right.
Performance has officially been recognised after almost 3 decades.
I know, and it's about time too.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
So very excited and interested to talk about that. And then we've got this shortlist, which... Shall I read through all of these? This is going to take me about 5 minutes
Why not?
Do you all know what's on the Forward shortlist already? I mean, you're here for an event on Saturday afternoon. I'll go through them very quickly. Best collection, Self-Portrait as Othello by Jason Allen Paysant, Bright Fear by Mary Jean Chan, A Change in the Air by Jane Clark, The Ink Cloud Reader by Kit Fan, My Name is Abelena by Elizabeth Sennett Clough. So they are up for the best collection prize, which is £10,000. I was noticing that it's been £10,000 for a while, so in real terms, unfortunately.
This is about, £6,000, yeah.
For a poet. And then the best prize for first collection, which I think is worth £5,000, is a collection called Isdal by Susanna Dickey, A Method, a Path by Rowan Evans, Cane, Corn and Gully by Sophia Kamaria Kinshasha, Bad Diaspora Poems by Montaza Mary, and Cowboy by Candace Siobhan Walker. And then go through the... Should we go through the...
Yeah, why
My
not?
mouth's getting dry reading this out. Okay, best single poem. Catherine Bevis, My Body Tells Me That She's Filing for Divorce. Malika Booker, Libation. Kitsia Burton, Oh Do You Know the Flower Man? Breda Spate, The Curse. And Eric Yip, Fricatives. Then best single poem performed, Zena Edwards, Human Disembodied Knowledge. Michael Peterson, The Cat Prince. Boden Pisecki, Almost Certainly. Roger Robinson, The City Kids See the Sea. And Nida Zak Aria Ipi, and Our Eyes Are on Europe. That's the title of the poem. So there we are. Okay, I think I have discharged my chair duties, and now I'm going to go over to our judges. Yeah, just to ask you for first thoughts on what's new in the poetry landscape, because there's a lot in the press release from the Forward Prizes about how this is showing what's new, what's changing in poetry. Karen, first on the collections, and then Khadijah.
Yeah. I was really thinking about it in the context of, I think actually what was exciting, basically you kind of end up with this, can I just say this bit? People have to know, all these books start arriving, and then there are these boxes, and then there's one box, and then there's another box, and then there's another box. There's a lot of boxes.
I think, was it 270 I saw mentioned?
It's a huge amount.
Okay.
Yeah. And they kind of pile up, and you look at them, and, part of you feels a bit overwhelmed, part of you feels incredibly excited because you're going to be able to read, a really large representation of what's out there in the poetry landscape. So it's a kind of sense of trepidation, but also, excitement about what is, and then you start to sort of get into it, and, you have to whittle it down, you get to the long list, and then you go to a short list. I was thinking actually it's a little bit like, the final poem is maybe like a bit of a haiku. The final, the winner is maybe the haiku, and then, around that is perhaps the high bun of the short and long list, and then you've got this sort of larger book of the ambient field of things that maybe didn't come your way.
You begin with the epic and you end.
Exactly, with this little tiny haiku, this snapshot of a moment, and it's a moment in the poetry landscape. But actually, just to stay with that haiku reference, it is actually tethered to the landscape. The poem will be tethered to the landscape. And I kind of felt like, I was thinking about that idea of nation. And actually my first thought, Jeremy, was, oh God, the poetry. Well, I hope that poetry is in a better state than the nation. Because we want that. But actually, amongst that is this idea of, what do poets do in that space? What do we do? What is the test? What is the resistance, the material? The world out there as material, and us as the poet, and how we write to, from, within, and against that as well. And so, I sort of was really interested to see, I felt like generally a lot more collections that maybe are sort of taking on longer narratives. So perhaps sort of less of the sort of, and that's been happening for a little while, but I felt, very much so that was the case this year. And if we think about, where we are here in Britain, we're post-pandemic, a global pandemic, where, we're experiencing that, it's a sort of bit of a rough ride, with Brexit. So, what are people, thinking around that sort of idea of nationhood? And I think that there's a very strong, what I picked up sort of thematically was there's a real sense of placemaking.
Okay.
In the work of people, and doing that really quite deeply. So you've got people like Rowan Evans on the Best First Collection short list. And it's very interesting. He's a sound artist, and I would maybe call that like what I might describe as a sort of work of deep placemaking, sort of deep ecology. It's archaeological it's sort of translating various texts from Old English and then, thinking about that vocabulary and what that means in sense of the land, sense of being English, of Englishness. I mean, he really explores that. Very kind of, quite a sort of worrisome, sort of like really into, that was another thing. I'm going to stop rambling and just say, placemaking, intertextuality, lots of intertextuality, longer narratives, the eye of the essayist, the travelogue movement. I mean, thinking of us being insular, but actually the poetry looking out into the world.
Yeah.
Poetry of witness that reflects us back to us, who we are, as well as the world around us. I would say sort of like a freshness. Some of those voices felt very fresh, very new. There I was with my boxes going, oh gosh, yeah, it's getting a little bit smaller, it's getting a little bit smaller. And then suddenly I would sit up and lean in and be like, oh my God, this poet has me and I can't move. I'm just like, how did they do that?
Well,
you know that feeling? How did they do
that?
that?
Yeah. It's very exciting when you get that feeling. And I hope that, the shortlist reflects a number of your favourites, although I'm sure it doesn't reflect all. And that's a question I probably can't ask you for diplomatic reasons, is what were your real favourites?
I am a little bit of the five-pointed star.
Okay. There will be a chance I wanted to ask people in the room, if you've read any of the books or know any of the poets on the shortlist, to hear from you a bit later on when we'll be doing a Q&A and we'll have a mic going around. So think about that. Get your answers ready. Khadijah, do you want to tell us a bit about the business of, because, sifting through, 270 boxes of books is one thing, but how many single poems are published in a year? Thousands and thousands. How did you approach this?
And I no longer remember the number of poems that was in that list, but I do know that the thing about going through these poems, you have to have some kind of system attached to you and how you're sifting through these poems. And I had no system.
Okay.
I had no system.
But somebody once told me that you have to have a system.
Yeah. I was told later on that I needed to have a system. But I really was reading those poems like I would read a collection. Some of these poems I was reading for the first time. And you know what grabs you the first time around when you're reading it. And then sometimes you think, I just need to read that poem again, because I'm not quite sure. So I really didn't have a system attached to going through these poems, but I know that I had a pile, and then they were also online, that it wasn't going anywhere. I was just going, it just felt like the pile was never ever going down. And the deadline was coming for long listing and short listing. And so what I was coming across in some of these poems is that, similar to what Karen's saying, is this thing of belonging, this sense of placing self in the environment and observing the environment in different ways. And people had so many different ways in which they were looking at these themes. And there was no, these single poems were about all types of things, all types of happenings. But one of the things I realized in reading this, I said, this really does confirm that the poet is usually the most interesting observer of life. They observe life in such detail and nothing escapes them. And I say that as a poet, for myself as well, and that they capture small elements as a glimpse, that would be a glimpse to the everyday person, and they really extract so much out of that small thing. The environment became this, in a lot of the pieces that I was reading, this sense of placing oneself into the environment, looking at what is happening, having this sense of recreating a liminal space in which the poem could find itself in a comfortable place. And so I found that what people were doing was really experimenting with themes and language and really trying to dissect the way people have been writing in the past and really recreating a new narrative on the page. And it became art on the page for so many of those writers. So not only are you looking at the words on the page and reading the words on the page, you're really trying to extract the meaning and the sense of what that person is trying to convey to the reader. So that was quite exciting in so many different ways for me. There were so many there that I loved. I was like, I really love these pieces. But when you're, like Karen said, that 5-pointed star, when you're in that environment, and that was new for me in that way, you realize that that's also a way of having a strategy of thinking about how are we looking at poems? Why are we addressing these poems in a particular way? What does that other reader see that you have not seen thus so far? And then that really creates an interesting moment to really open your eyes in a different way and have a real sense of grounding yourself in the narrative, in which that's what the poet does. So I always say, the poet will tell you things about the world that you probably wouldn't be observing genuinely in your home or genuinely in your everyday life.
And when you went, so you described that process for us of sifting, is that just for the single poem written shortlist? Because I'm really curious to know about how do you begin to bring together a shortlist for performed? Was it recordings or?
So the performances were recorded. Now I thought that was going to be quite easy because I thought, right, it's like watching TV, isn't it? You just sit back and watch, and you're like, no, actually, it's not, because you really have to concentrate on. Now you're listening to narrative, and you're looking at performance. And what was quite interesting for this new category is there was no real hard, deadline kind of firm criteria for judging this new area of performance. And how do you do that? I perform, and I realize there are people who write very well for the page. They're page poets. People will enjoy their poetry. And there are those who are page poets and stage poets. And so even the way that they attack a poem on the page and the way that it manifests on the stage is something quite different. And then there are people who write for the stage. And it's not necessarily that poem will be published on the page. There's something else that you're looking at, the way that they use body language, the way that they use their voice. And so we had so many different people submitting their videos. And what was quite beautiful about this is that because it had no criteria and it was very open, you saw people in their bedrooms, in their kitchens, in their cars, outside.
Was it sort of like poetry TikTok, just kind of?
Even better than that, though.
Okay, no, sorry,
much better than poetry TikTok. And then you had those that had poetry films. They were edited quite well. And so what was the criteria that we were looking at? And we battled with that. We were grappling with, what are we looking for in these performances? And for me, I was listening to the voice. I was listening to the text read aloud. I was also observing the body language. So for those that were fortunate to have their videos performed live in maybe at an open mic, you began to observe body language. For those who didn't have that comfort and they were in their homes trying to create a video because they know they're good performers, you had to then listen, for me, I had to then listen to the language. What were they saying? And I think, for videos and performance, not just the video, but the act of live performance is valuable as the page poem, as the page poet. It's been around probably a lot longer than the page poetry. When we think about even the troubadours, and we go back far, okay. The whole thing of performing to a public audience, outside or indoors.
Yeah,
it really has its place.
Greek epic is oral poetry originally before it gets written down centuries later.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, and in terms of sort of more recent history, I was writing last week on my blog, my Substack, about I went to see Linton Kwesi Johnson perform, but he was just reading.
Yeah.
But it was beautiful because of the way he read and because of the voice.
That's right.
But I was thinking about how much I love the records with the music as well. But what his achievement is, in a way, is to be both page and stage, because he found a way to write that voice exactly on the page, so that actually when you look at it, you can hear it, as it were, through your eyes.
Yeah.
But then I brought along a little, I like to kind of bring books and wave them at people, because I'm a university lecturer. This book was from 1992, which is an anthology of performance poetry, mainly from the Apples and Snakes
right.
outfit in London, you know, who were going in the 80s really promoting performance poetry. And there's a lot of names in here you recognize: Jean Binter-Breeze, Jackie Kay, Linton Kwesi Johnson, John Agar, Grace Nichols, Ian Macmillan, Benjamin Zephaniah. And this appeared when the Forward Prizes for Poetry started. But, you know, and this is a Forward Prizes anthology from the 90s. These two things never met in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was partly a technology thing, because you couldn't really have videos and easily available performances. You had to kind of be there.
And that's a really great point, you know, recording somebody performing in a venue or outdoors, wherever it may be, it wasn't really readily accessible. You had to go to those venues. You had to be at the open mic. You had to be at the performances to actually see them. And I think what's happened is people are beginning to really add value to the poet that reads well on the stage. There's nothing like, for me, there's nothing like going to an event and listening to a poet who's they're just reading and there's no life. You want life in the poetry. You want to feel the poem manifest from the page. And I think I say that because I spent 10 to 12 years working with young people around poetry and poetry slams, going to America and watching these young people being scored for the page. They're writing on the page, but also how they performed on the stage. And that's when I began to realize the importance of performance. And I say about myself that I write for performance. That's the key thing, that my poems must be performed. And that performance doesn't necessarily mean, it's about the body. It means about the way in which you find rhythm in the voice. So Jean Binter-Breeze, Linton Kwesi Johnson, you know, Jackie Kay, these are really great examples of people who really perform their poetry and really give the sense of transporting you from one place to another. They carry you through the narrative, and that's what's really important. And so for me, judging this category, I wanted to be transported. It didn't matter if they were not on the stage. For me, it was the voice and the text. How did they transport me and bring me into acquaintance with the text to take me on this journey? And that's what I was looking for, and that's what I was listening for.
Well, I'm looking forward to. Are they online? Do you know? Is the shortlist? Can we watch the performances?
Of course, I'm not quite sure. Look, I'm just getting a nod over here.
Somebody look on their phone.
Yes, I do believe, and I think that you would really enjoy just listening to some of these poets and the way that they're really driving their narrative through. And there are different levels of poetry in terms of what they're saying, what the themes are, you know, and the way that they drive those themes through. So for me, it's transporting, it's the way in which they're using all these writing devices, the way that they're really tackling and grappling with themes.
But formal techniques. Like, is there something like in particular you'd pick out as a, you know, like a technique that you're noticing a lot of poets using? But I know you've got page and stage to think about.
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure if there's a particular technique that I'm coming across, but what I'm looking at and what I'm coming across mainly is the way in which people are redressing poetry and making it more contemporary. They're looking at older narratives, like old narratives, and taking it in, moving it into the contemporary landscape. The way in which they're using these metaphors to really bring that poetry alive, and you know, helping us to come into acquaintance with the text a lot more.
okay,
So that's what I'm coming across.
Is that, when we were talking before the event, Karen, you mentioned rhyme. You thought rhyme is maybe having a bit of a... I feel like rhyme's always having a comeback, but maybe perhaps it has sort of gone away and is coming back in a sort of more formal way. I mean, I'd be interested to hear from you, Khadijah, whether rhyme is sort of central to spoken word in any way. But...
I always say, if you're rhyming, you better be really good at it.
Okay.
That's why when I'm teaching poetry, I say, please don't rhyme unless you're really good at it.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think what rhyme can do, if you're not good at it, it can restrict your sense of creativity because you're looking for that next word to rhyme. So if you're good at it, go for it. But I don't know.
Interesting. I had a conversation with a poetry MA student just this week where he was
Yeah.
writing these brilliant poems, and then we came to one that he decided, for quite complex reasons, to put into rhyming couplets. And I was like, this one's just not working so well for me because suddenly the lines are getting awkward and it's actually quite bumpy.
Yeah. And the thing of haikus, I think, is really making a great comeback as well in different ways. I'm not sure what Karen thinks in terms of that, but I was really I'm coming across the way people are really trying to experiment more with the haiku.
Yeah, okay, that is interesting. Did you notice that in the books, or do you want to talk about the
I was going
rhyme?
to go back to rhyme, actually, just because, I think that idea that it better be good, hell yeah, it better be good. I think, actually, Kit Fan has got a brilliant line in one of his poems, which is, rhyme like love is a big word. And
I read that one this morning on the train up, and then the poem ends by, it's called Geraniums in May?
Yeah, Geraniums in May.
And it ends by rhyming geranium and uranium.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Has that ever been done in the history of English before?
I mean, Ink Cloud Reader, it's got so much formal innovation in it.
Right.
But the poem just before that, which I'm trying to remember, but that's all A's. It's a sonnet, all A rhymed. It's amazing, full rhyme.
Is that the one with all the oo rhymes
The
in
U.
it? Yeah, the U, yeah.
I mean, Louise Gluck is, I've never seen a rhyme in Gluck, but, he's got poems in there that are doing things like reviewing the whole Gluck opus in a 3-page, 3-act sort of dialogue drama with the sun and shadow and wind, all all actual
this
actors
is
in this
Nobel
drama.
Prize winner Louise Gluck.
Yes,
her
it is.
collected poems, big chunky book from Penguin, has been turned into a poem by Kit Fan, which has the form of a
3-act
drama.
sort of drama with so we've got shadow, sun. They're all in. We're having a bit of a barney. I mean, it's great.
So that seems like a good example of what you said, intertextuality, poems that have other books behind them, beneath them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, Jason Allen Payson, self-portrait as a fellow. And there it's like, there it's got very much the spirit of the travelogue spirit.
And he uses different languages. He uses French and Italian.
Yeah, French, Italian. This idea that people don't expect to find a Jamaican in Paris speaking French, do they? But there he is. But then, what he does is he gives us there's a historicity to it. So it's not just about this idea that the migrant is constantly seeking to disembark, but actually, there's been a whole history, over centuries, and that's a literary history, it's a cultural history, geographic, etc. Do I have anything else to say about rhyme? Just because, yes, I do.
Okay, yeah.
And that is that longer works, longer narratives. So it's not on the list, but there's a book called Couplets. That's a whole novel in rhyming couplets. Given that it's a whole novel in rhyming couplets, I was, it's pretty well handled. I mean, back to go on the list, Isdal, Susanna Dickey, which, that book is just sort of formally, it's so ambitious, it's so innovative. You've got a kind of a social literary critique of the true crime podcast written almost using the techniques of a true crime podcast, and it's rhymed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
wow.
Which
is
it's
not a
rhymed.
traditional technique of the true
crime podcast. Well, you know what? I'm so squeamish that, I was new to the true crime podcast, but I was like, oh my God, this is so good. And then you're like sitting forward in your seat because you're getting to the next bit. And it's very it's gruesome because it's Isdal refers to this woman found, and it's a body that's found, and then they kind of open out the story from there, from this body. Who was this woman? What is the mystery that unfolds? And at the same time, Susanna Dickey is also asking you to look at, what is what are the ethics of that? What is my complicity in becoming hooked into this narrative and these larger narratives that we have in the media?
Yeah.
But some of it was done with rhyme, and I was like, yeah, this is, and it was good rhyme. And then sometimes you're like, oh, hold on. And one of the reasons why I think rhyme is so important, because rhyme actually, if you just want to say, what is it? It's music. In rhyme, we have the music, we have the assonance, we have poetry as song, as lyric, as, it's heightened, it lifts. that's why we want it to be well handled, because we don't like a bad song.
Although, on the other side, and I sort of declare an interest here because I edited an anthology of prose poetry.
Yeah.
It seems to me there is more prose being used by poets, maybe just in a mix with verse, so kind of like maybe formal verse, regular meter, and then they'll break into some prose pieces, and then they'll come back to rhyme or whatever.
That's interesting, actually, Jeremy. I'm just thinking about that. And perhaps I think maybe that's why I felt like, oh, rhyme. Because there has been more prose, you know? We have, and I think that relationship with prose is also related to this, like I said, this sort of sense of wanting to capture longer stories.
Yeah.
Is it the feature film rather than the Polaroid? You know?
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's, if we sort of think of it in visual terms, it could be that.
Because a few years ago, obviously, Claudia Rankine Sitson won the Ford Prize? Yeah, it did, yeah. And then I think it was Vani Capildeo won the year after with Measures of Expatriation. Both of which, Sitson almost entirely, and the Capildeo book also a lot, were dominated by prose. And, for me, that was a very exciting moment that, this form, which had previously never won a poetry prize. There was a famous example in the 90s where Mark Strand, the American poet, was disqualified from winning a prize because his book was prose poetry, and it couldn't win because it didn't have line breaks in it. And I feel like that's really changed in the last 10 years. But now, are we seeing now maybe people just feeling free to mix their forms? And
yeah, I definitely think so. And there's always got to be a shift. Yeah. We have gatekeepers that say, this is good poetry, this isn't good poetry. And I think what's happening with poets and prizes is that the poet is shifting, they're shifting the narrative in different ways, and they're sticking to their guns and saying, actually, this is the way I want to express myself. These are the things I want to talk about, and I'm not going to be restricted by gatekeepers. Yeah. And I think that's what's happening. They're really kind of putting themselves out there. They're vulnerable. Just even when people are writing about grief, when they're writing about health conditions, because these are some of the things that I was coming across: grief, health conditions, the way people were observing even their own personal life or losing family members and being able to use that as a narrative, or watching someone suffer. They're really saying, actually, I want to be out there and I want to really talk about the reality of the world. And this is why it's really important to listen to the poet, read what the poet is saying, because they're really kind of experimenting with what is happening in the world. And they're really trying to do that, whether it's through prose, whether it's through rhyme, whether it's through this whole sense of how the poem sits on the page. Yeah. It might be a verse on the page, and then you have to flick over and find something else. They're really kind of pushing those boundaries in so many different ways. And I think that's really, really important. And that's the thing that excites me a lot in poetry.
So a lot of contemporary poetry is addressing what might be thought of as quite hard, quite heavy themes.
Yeah.
Sitson was a book about racism, microaggressions became a term that was associated with it. And yet, when we were talking earlier, I think, Karen, at least you were talking about, a book that made you laugh. Like where is the place for humour in contemporary poetry? Do you find a lot? Performance poetry, do they want to get a reaction from the crowd by getting a laugh line in there?
It would be a common stereotype to say that's what performance poetry does.
That's what I wondered.
That it's there to make the audience laugh, but there are people that do that so well. That they can have a great sense of humour in their performance, but still deal with something quite serious. A great example of someone that can do that very, very well, and I really love to see him perform, is Lem Sisse. He's got this sense of keeping the audience, breaking out from the poem or the narrative to tell you a story, and it takes you right back in. And so when you're going to watch people perform, that there's all of those elements that's going to take place, but yet they really want to tell you about that poem. They really want to perform that poem, and they know how to handle the audience. And I think that's a skilled performer.
Yeah. How about humour in collections, Karen? Because I guess there's no light verse in there. One of the most popular living poets in Britain is Wendy Cope, who writes light and less light verse. But
I wouldn't say quite so much. I didn't see that much light verse.
no.
And
What I
not
mean,
later- and
what I
certainly
mean
not
is
later in
there's
the
not really
process.
light verse, but is there
Yeah,
humour?
I'm joking, actually.
Okay. Sorry, I'm asking a question about humour being very.
Yeah, no, and actually, it is good to laugh, isn't it? And I was thinking, actually, my name is is it Abilene? I don't quite know how to say
I don't know.
Abilene,
Yeah.
Abilene. It's sort of part of the song. Anyway, I want somebody to kind of go, yes, just like start singing it to me from the audience there. Anyway, the Elizabeth Sennett cloth, I mean, that's really fascinating because it's sort of this wild reworking of the Dear John letter, but she's actually dealing with some really serious issues in those poems. She's dealing with rape, domestic abuse, but, somehow there's something in it. It's not quite, not that you're sort of laughing at those moments, but she turns it round and it's transformative. And some of the ways that she transforms those experiences is through humor. It's a kind of like, just get your stilettos on, get down the road because we are, and it's actually great because it's kind of like, a rural, it's working class, rural Cambridgeshire fens.
Okay.
And she actually kind of like brings that whole community to life through.
So that sense of place you were talking about.
That sense of place again, yeah. And I was like, oh wow, I didn't, I knew about town and gown, but there's like gown town and then there's the sticks. And then that's the other sort of third bit, and she's sort of talking about that area. So I found, and then sort of bringing with it this sort of, there's some amazing poems there that actually contextualizes that. I'm getting serious again, aren't I? Are there more?
Well, actually,
are there some more jokes in all of this?
I was on the train up. I was reading some of Bad Diaspora poems by Montaz Mary, which
thank you.
I've been looking forward to as a collection. And I have to say, I mean, for me, I haven't read any of the other collections on the Best First Collection list, but they're gonna have to be good to beat it because
they are.
Yeah, it's amazing. But one of the things I really love about her writing is how it has this extremely dry, sharp, quite dark humor. I mean, it's so quotable. There are lots of sort of lines that just jump out. There was a line that jumped out. It's quite a light one for her, but it was to do with, I think there should be more toddler hecklers at poetry readings.
It's exactly. I mean, she has this amazing aphoristic quality. And it's the ability to just, recreate the self in this way that you literally had never thought of, and she just does it over and over again through,
sort of maybe it's not sort of comedy, but it's wit. It's like sort of putting it in a way that you want to remember.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I found that there's a real wit. It's it's strongly intellectual work as well, but it's very, very warm and it's funny and it's open. So,
and I mean, even calling the book Bad Diaspora Poems in itself is a sort of joke about maybe something that, she's aware that there are a lot of books which could be called diaspora poems, and then calling them bad diaspora poems. What does that mean?
Yeah, and it could be taken in many different ways, that bad. Is it a bad poem? Is it bad, like good? Or is it sardonic in itself? There's different ways that you could read that. I think, in a way, in that collection, she does sort of, Khadijah, you were sort of saying about, what kind of poem a poem can be. And is there space for it to also be a bad diaspora poem? And maybe it's a good one, maybe it's a bad one. I mean, it's a very confident title.
And it's it's about 100 pages long as well, this book. So it's got an enormous amount of work in there.
Yeah. Well, it's also, Jeremy, it's also like, I think that particular book, Montaz Mary, is also an essayist. So that's another little, I would say, sort of trend, preoccupation, or perhaps shift. And I think that's been going on for a little while, but, the poet and, thinking about your prose poems, but also the lyric essay. I mean, that's sort of, some of my own work is, goes into that space.
Yeah.
But I think it's almost like the borders between, poetry and prose, they're still there, but they are more porous. There's more capacity for experimentation, to be imaginative in that space and not to go, oh my God, I can only do this thing. And I absolutely adore strongly formal, well-achieved work. But with, from that, we can also, kind of lift off into these amazing, kind of really quite, there's quite a lot of erasure work, not a huge amount of erasure work, but, actually seeing visual work that is, using the erasure technique as well, for example. There's Nicole Seeley, which she goes across the whole of the Ferguson report as an erasure piece. And it's an amazing lyric poem that emerges from that. So, there's so much formal innovation. I think it's incredible.
It makes me think of, we're talking about best collection, best first collection, but again, Varney Capildeo, who won the Forward Prize with the Measures of Expatriation, which was mainly in prose, said that I don't write collections, I write books. And I wonder if it's that kind of attitude which has really sort of set a trend in the last 10 years of actually, I'm not just going to write, as it were, 40 little poems with titles that can come together into a book that qualifies for a competition, but I'm actually going to set out to write a project. That has become something that we see more of.
I think there's more of that, definitely. Yeah. And I think it's, it doesn't have to be at the expense of anything else.
No, not at all.
But I think that it's valuable because as we're constantly thinking, aren't we? What can poetry do? What can poetry be? What can it do in the world? What's its action? If it's witnessing, what are the changes that it witnesses around us? I mean, if you look out into the world that we see around us, I mean, you said TikTok poetry.
We were kind of joking.
But we were kind of joking. But the actual reality is that there are so many different ways in which we receive material, text, content, all of those things, literature. You've got your Substack.
Exactly.
I mean, there's just different ways that we, kind of like have material. And I see it, and that's the thing with, performance. That's another sort of a formal possibility. It's a formal possibility for a poem. If you're writing, for performance itself, then that will be your core, loyalty, as it were. But you might also be working on the page and then have something, I'm working on something now, it's going to be an animation as well. And so, those are, and then that could be shared, it will be short, so it could be shared upon, I don't know if I'll ever do TikTok. I just don't know if I've got it in me. It feels so epic. But like,
I'm just keeping an eye on the time because it's my job.
Banging on about
No.
Well, sorry, I'm excited.
I wanted to
out
say,
of space.
would people in the room like to either ask questions, tell us about any of the things on the shortlist that they like, or even I'd be interested to hear about things that are not on the shortlist. If you want to kind of tell us about something that you think is really good this year.
Hi, I just wanted to go back to the new category. So with the new forward category of performance poets, I just wanted your opinion on is there any hope left for us page poets?
Who's that question to?
To you.
Oh, to me, sorry. Is there any hope left for page poets? There's lots of hope for page poets. I think page poetry actually takes precedence, especially for prizes. Such as the Forward Prize, for example.
£10,000 for page poets.
Yeah, when you think about it. And I believe that people will always value the page. They'll value the book. I value the page, I value the book, And as much as I might say I write for performance, that piece has to be able to go into a book and be published. It has to not just look well on the page, but be part of that collection that I'm writing. And you said something quite interesting, because I know there's a lot of poets who don't just say, right, I'm writing poems and then hopefully I'll get a collection. I'll dip out of that and get a collection. They're actually writing along themes. They're really exploring narrative in different ways. We've got, for example, on the shortlist for Best Single Poem is Malika Booker with Libation. And just knowing that, knowing some of her work is experimenting with language and the Bible and women, and grief, all these elements.
And the sonnet.
And the sonnet, and the sonnet.
As well.
And
just you.
Yeah, her work works fantastic on the page, but also in performance as well. So there's always, having this category for performance poetry doesn't take away and does not lessen the page poet at all. It really just shows the value of both. And I think we've been waiting a long time to have this category, and I'm so pleased that the Forward Prize has introduced this. And I think other organisations will start to think about the importance of the stage, the importance of the poet reading on the stage and performing on the stage, and just really give it its value, because that's so important, especially to people who are writing on the page who feel like that if they were in this category, it would take away the value of their poetry on the page, and that's not really the case at all.
Great, thank you. Have we got another question?
Thanks. Just in terms of talking about the creativity and experimentation going on, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the use of AI and ChatGPT, not just to say, write me a poem about this, but using it as an actual tool to help you to develop your narratives. Is that something that you could see could ever be allowed within the poetry world? Or and I know that there's stories going on about short story writing and in an art as well, so I'd be interested
I
to know.
love that question. I mean, actually, I have a that's great, because I can actually plug my book. It's a brilliant question. No, but seriously, I've got a verse novel coming out next year, and it's all in the voices of dolls. But one of the dolls speaks a sort of hybrid language in between sort of French and English American and doll. But to get that voice, what I did, I mean, this isn't AI, because actually this was before ChatGPT, but I did use a kind of mechanized process to get the voice. And that was, and also because my French is so bad. And then so she speaks a bad French. And then, so I put the line into Google Translate. And then I got it back in French. And then I put the bad line in French back into Google Translate. And then I had this kind of sort of jumbled up kind of crazy grammar. And I also had the ear of somebody I know in my head to get that voice. So, I mean, that's not quite ChatGPT, because I think AI, it's the idea of, kind of, is it sort of replacement? More behind that. But I would say that is maybe a creative use of technology and language. And that would always be something that I'm very happy to expose. And anyway, it was really just as a kind of part of process, part of the process. I mean, and I think that's a really interesting thing in terms of just thinking when you said about hope. Well, I think process, a prize is, like we said, it's a snapshot, and £10,000, and it's a snapshot and £10,000, and everything else, and it's wonderful. But actually, the process of writing, that's the thing that you want to know is there when you read the collections, but you can't quite work out what they've done or how they did it, like I said.
Yeah.
But you're trying to sort of get into that.
I noticed when the ChatGPT stories came out, a lot of newspapers sort of immediately went, can it write poems? And it could write sort of quite bad poems. It could write sort of newspapery poems. It could rhyme, quite interesting how it managed to rhyme. But I thought, okay, I'll test it a bit. It cannot do style. It cannot kind of capture what a particular poet's style is. It just has poetry style. And I wrote a bit about this as well, sort of thinking, like, what are the limits here? Is it going to replace poets, And actually I came up with an answer which is sort of kind of moving towards performance, which is that, poetry has to be written by someone with a body. Even if it's not a performance poem, it has to be somehow come through the head and, all the senses.
Yeah, I think definitely it's about that sense of creativity and, any writer, whether they're a novelist, they're essayist or poet, whatever, there is that sense of it's that thing of ritual. There's a thing of ritual, the ritual of research and reading and then writing. And there's that process that every writer will take themselves through and find themselves in a space that keeps them quite happy. And even though it can feel, for me sometimes, it's like, oh God, this is really, it's not difficult for me. What it is being able to stay in that place longer because you have something else that you have to do. So, you find poets will go on retreats. They'll turn off their phone. They'll have this ritual of, don't call me, or my phone is off. I've got friends like that. I go, I know they're writing, so I'm not even going to try and contact them because they'll give you the heads up. The phone's off for days and days and days. They're not dead. Yeah, they're writing. And I think AI can't do that. AI can't come up with that creativity, that sense of what Karen was saying, how people are evolving in the way that they're writing, how they're dealing with language. I don't know, because I don't know about AI, to be honest. Somebody was talking to me about it the other day, and I was like, well, what does it do? The conversation actually came up because of somebody working in the university and saying the university are now having these discussions about people writing maybe their dissertations and their essays.
That's a big thing.
Yeah, and I think maybe it can deal with that kind of thing, AI.
Yeah.
But
It can trot out sort of balanced overviews, gathering together, general data, but in a way, a poem isn't that. And I think perhaps what you're saying, and I'm sort of conscious, we're coming to time, so maybe sort of just summing up. But what's been coming out, particularly about sort of people wanting to respond to the now and the place, and sort of bring that experience in that poets observe. Is this? I mean, I'm not saying it's a sort of just a reaction to ChatGPT, but is this a response to that idea that, in a way, so much of our lives is spent not in a particular place because we can be online so much? There is this dematerialization. There is this sort of way in which the body kind of, the mind can leave the body through social media, through WhatsApp and whatever, and that maybe poets are reacting against that by saying, no, this is where I live, this is where I've seen things, heard things, these are things, and there's still lots of things. These are things you can't find on the internet.
you can't find it on the internet.
I'm always saying to my students, there are loads of books in the library you can't find on the internet.
No.
There's a meme actually which around this AI question, and it says, "How come the robots are getting to make art and write poems, and I'm, delivering pizzas and scrubbing floors?" And maybe that's a question. Maybe that's the question.
Well, perhaps one day we'll be back here discussing the best ChatGPT generated poem shortlist. But just for now, I just want to thank Karen McCarthy, Woolf, Khadijah, Ibrahiim, and thank you to everybody for coming along, listening.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been lovely days.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to everyone who attended our 2024 Bradford Literature Festival and helped to make it such a success. You'll be able to listen back to some of our selected events in the new series, coming soon.